Year 9, 10 and 11, welcome to some revision on Porphyria's Lover in preparation for your English literature exam. This is by no means everything you need, it's just some focus areas. I've tried to be judicious so that we don't say everything that everybody else is going to say, and so that we try to avoid the obvious. This video is on the understanding that you know the poem as well, so if you don't know the poem, perhaps go and read it. The title of the poem changed. Originally, Robert Browning had called it Porphyria, which obviously places heavy focus on her. And then he changed it to Porphyria's Lover. So now there's a little bit more focus on the speaker and perhaps the notion of a forbidden relationship. And this notion that we don't know who he is, Porphyria's Lover, it's almost as well as if his importance is gained through her, Porphyria's Lover, that at the beginning of the poem, it's as if he belongs to her. But naturally, there's going to be a power shift as the poem progresses. The title, a lot of students research the title and then they get confused. Porphyria really means, I suppose, on his link to nobility, and since purple is commonly associated with royalty, and that's where our link comes from with Porphyria. So again, we've got this notion that perhaps he is forbidden from being with her, which I suppose links to some of Robert Browning's other poems like My Last Duchess. If you research that word on Google or Wikipedia or whatnot, then it's going to come up with like blood disease or something like that. But that word wasn't coined until after Robert Browning had written the poem. So I'll be careful with that. The meter is iambic tetrameter, so that is 8 syllables per line, and the stress is on the second syllable. So we go the rain set early into, and you can say that that is the stress, but you've got to be careful that because at the pivotal moment, or at pivotal moments during the play, the meter breaks down, perhaps revealing the psychotic nature of the speaker, or the disintegration of his feelings, or perhaps the change within him as the poem progresses. But perhaps more importantly, the internal conflict of the speaker. I think as you read Porphyria's Lover, it is clear that he is internally conflicted between his emotions, between something arguably forbidden, between sexual desire, between owning her. And one of the key moments where it does change is I listened with heart fit to break. And you can see that then what happens there is that your stress falls on heart fit and then break. So just be careful with your meter, but for the most part it is iambic tetrameter. Think again about how he controls what he says. He controls his punctuation. This is a dominant man, and that again links you to Robert Browning's other poems like My Last Duchess, where in a lot of his poems cover a psychotic killer. We begin with the pathetic fallacy. The rain set early into night, the sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. Now your vocabulary immediately creates an unsettling atmosphere if you look at vex, sullen and tore. Ask yourself if the pathetic fallacy then is a reflection of our speaker. Probably is. This notion of something vexed, to bring trouble and distress, agitation. And then if you go in the dictionary, and I try to get my students to do that, there's 3 different meanings: to bring physical distress, to irritate or annoy. Now, physical distress is an interesting one, because the physical distress of our speaker is going to then be, initially it's internalized and then it becomes physical, and he's going to take it out on her when he strangles her. But the sullen as well, the sullen wind, gloomy, resentfully silent. So that's interesting because when she first comes into the cottage, they don't speak to one another, do they? So that again is the pathetic fallacy by Robert Browning. He is setting up and foreshadowing your entire poem. And then this notion of, like I say, vex, you've got sullen, the fact that it's raining, it sounds quite dull. And then that is then linked to the breaking of his heart. The elm tree symbolism, then, if we're aiming for the 7, the 8 and the 9, well, the main aspect of the elm symbolism is strength. And in that quality, it leaves behind the most powerful trees, such as the oak. So the elm actually is symbolically stronger than an oak tree. Now, elm's strength is dark and heavy, and if you, again, research it, it feeds on primary instinct rather than conscious decision. So basically, the tree has much too much passion, sorry, I've reworded that wrong, and its anger can become unmanageable because it's the most dominant one, and we know that it'll be taking resources from nature, water, the nutrients from the ground, etc. Now, if we just go back up there to the second bullet point, then naturally, again, Robert Browning's probably picked this tree because of that. It feeds on primary instinct. Can you then argue that our speaker, his primary instinct is to kill her? Rather than using a conscious decision and thinking it through, he kills her. And we get that line, and strangled her, and then your Caesura follows it. So think about the symbolism of that tree. The vocabulary changes from the pathetic fallacy as well to her and her entrance when glided in Porphyria. Now look, massive instance of Caesura. It heightens the entrance of her. Like the narrator, we take note of her entrance and then glide. She's effortless, she's smooth, there's something very graceful about her. Again, is there an implication of royalty, of something in the hierarchy that makes her powerful? And then we get warm, which juxtaposes the earlier sullen wind. So she changes the atmosphere upon her entrance, and therefore our vocabulary and our lexical field also changes. And she warms the cottage. Caesura is hugely important in Browning's poem, and I've just picked out a couple of examples. And last she sat down by my side and called me. Last there is heavily emphasised. Is it last because he feels put out, that she hasn't give him attention instantly? Is it just the ordering of this very matter-of-fact telling of what happens? This is what the weather is like. She came through the door. She greeted me. We've done this. And it's kind of more psychotic in the sense that it is controlled and calm. Notice as well, we had Caesura after her name, draws attention to her. We get Caesura to surround the word mine. We get and spread over all her yellow hair. Look at that. Overall, does she consume him? We get the pause after how she loved me. This is the verbal control, the control of his thoughts. If we're going down the dramatic monologue route, Porphyria worshipped me. Pause. Do we pause because he's hesitant at that idea? Is he convincing himself that she worshipped him? So lots in Caesura. When we get to lines 12 to 25, then we get a polysynthetic list, and accentuates her endless beauty in this description of her. Alternatively, though, and we want alternative interpretation for higher grades, it adds to the growing frustration of the speaker. Look at the last three lines of the poem, guys. And he's obsessed with that word, and he lists everything. And I think it does end up whereby we feel his frustration with her. So think about that, and as I say, the list to accentuate her endless beauty shows us that, is there an obsession on his part, or is it objectification? The colour yellow. Studies show, again, let's research our symbolism, that this adjective and the meaning of the colour yellow is warmth. When we get that when she enters. Cheerfulness, increased mental activity, increased muscle energy. When we go further, the colour yellow helps activate the memory, encourage communication, enhance vision, build confidence, and stimulate the nervous system. So I've picked out the interesting one there. Increased mental activity and confidence. Well, you could argue that, you know, this colour symbolically provokes his confidence into killing her, and the increased mental activity, because remember, we are watching, or we are listening to, or we are privy to his thoughts and feelings. So the increased mental activity here is the description of her, the description of how she dies, and the fact that they sit there, and that notion of necrophilia afterward as well. So interesting symbolism again. Because of the time the poem is written, is she objectified is a big one, because we get a description of her physical beauty. We get a description of her physically, the fact that she glides, the description of her hair, the mention of her shoulder, the mention of the waist. So the subtle connotations of sexual imagery. And I've asked there, is she too much for him? You know, sexually, or in terms of what she looks like, is she too much? Does he know that he's not good enough because we already had connotations of her royalty? As I mentioned earlier, does she consume him? The fact that her hair spreads over him. Almost an imagery of a fire there, which links to burning later on in the kiss. And there seems to be a definite power imbalance, which I suppose links you to the title. At this moment in the poem, we could argue that she is in control. Naturally, this is going to flip. And stooping made my cheek lie there. Now, I've put basically the dictionary on the slide there, so please pause it. But stoop is an interesting word as well, because again, look at your Caesura, therefore it's emphasised. It's a verb, and we get a lot of different meanings. To bend the body or a part of the body forward and downward, sometimes bending the knees. Okay. So, and stooping made my cheek lie there. Again, is there a sexual notion there? Probably. Or to stand or walk with a forward inclination? Fine. Number 2, though, is to yield, to submit. To descend from a superior rank, dignity or status, or to lower oneself morally. There we have it, guys. That word. Is she stooping by going out with him? If we've got the reading or the interpretation that she's royal, is this then her stooping and morally lowering herself in terms of the man she's with into class? Like I said earlier, is it forbidden? Okay. To move down from a height, and then at the bottom there, look, debase or degrade. To debase or to degrade oneself. Well, again, is that sexual, or is it the fact that she is stooping in terms of who this man is? So there's absolutely loads in that word, guys, so make sure that you get it there. And the fact that the Caesura surrounds it, again, makes us draw our attention to it. Struggling passion, I think, is huge. Sorry, I'm not very good with technology, so this is the best I can do for you, but it's arguably an oxymoron. She struggles against society, because we know that there's an inclination or there's a suggestion that she shouldn't be with him. But I think it's also the internal struggle of the speaker. This struggling passion, he's struggling with it, isn't he? And then what happens is it arguably becomes anaphora, because passion then, but passion sometimes would prevail. Now, if you track the progression of passion, it changes from a struggle to something that is he prevails. So again, your dictionary definition, to gain ascendancy through superiority. There's your power swap. And interesting, we get the conjunction but in here, which I do think always changes the mood of a poem. So again, the third meaning though is to use persuasion successfully. Massive. Again, massive in a poem like this, where we have a speaker who can eloquently control their thoughts and what they say. The internal conflict carries on with the juxtaposition of free and restrain. Again, look at restrain, to prevent from doing, exhibiting or expressing. Is he restraining what he really feels in terms of not verbalising it, and therefore comes out physically? To limit, to restrict, to keep under control. Well, that's exactly what he does to her by killing her and keeping the body. He essentially controls her. To moderate or limit the force, to deprive of liberty. Again, that's exactly what he does. He deprives her of her freedom when he kills her and keeps her. And that's where mind comes into play. So don't look past literal meaning, guys. Ominous repetition of mine. That moment she was mine, Caesura, fair, perfectly pure and good. That is so ominous. There's a subtle tone of something sinister in that mine. And then when you get the next bit after the colon, I found a thing to do. The euphemism of a thing. He's murdered her. Never mind a thing, it's denial. He uses a euphemism to denial the horror and the consequences of what he's done. So massive language and wordplay there by Browning. Untightened. Does it juxtapose restraint? I think so. Interesting as well that this word will come after she's died. Is it an emotional release of the speaker? Is it this notion where he's kind of like, oh, you know, everything's come to a head? Is he able to feel a release once she's dead? Because then he isn't feeling inferior. He isn't on edge. He isn't thinking about her beauty or jealous or all of these insecurities that have come to play under the surface of the poem. So it's interesting that we had restraint and now we get untightened. Blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. Well, plosive B sounds, it does subtly imply the violence of what's going on. He does strangle her. He doesn't really pay a lot of attention to that either. He flippantly says, "and strangled her, Caesura." It's almost not really a big deal. I think your plosive B sounds here, again, it's the internal rage. Yes, he controls and manipulates his language, but is he internally beginning to lose control? Burning as well, looking past the obvious there, means of fundamental importance. Is that a sexual reference? Because it's linked to kissing here. So as I said earlier, is she too much for him? Is she sexually too much for him? Or is sex something that is a driving force behind what he's done? And then that you've got that necrophilia link, sorry, I can't get my words out, link towards the end of the poem. That is all I'm going to say on Porphyria's lover, but there is loads more. I just wanted to be judicious. Massive good luck in your English literature exam.